Okay, so we're going to wrap up this section on diplomacy and World War I by talking about Wilson and his push for these so-called 14 points, the debate over the ratification of the treaty, specifically having to do with the League of Nations, and then a little bit about the politics of the 1920s. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Yes, it's real. The struggle is real. It was a giant yawn. But we will definitely be getting more into the politics of the 1920s in a separate conversation. So, Wilson's peace plan is known as the 14 points. So, he has 14 things, and they're all listed there on the right, that he would like to see as part of this Treaty of Versailles to end World War I. Keep in mind, though, that the different powers that are meeting to discuss the treaty have different priorities based on their role during the war. So, a country like France that experienced this direct invasion, that is neighbor to Germany, is going to want to see a much harsher punishment for Germany, than, let's say, the United States and Woodrow Wilson, who can afford to be maybe a little bit more ideological because we're further away, and we suffered greatly, certainly in terms of casualties and economic loss, even, but has a little bit more physical distance and emotional distance even from the war. So the first 5 of Wilson's 14 points all address the causes of the war. Open diplomacy, so no more secret treaties. Everyone is open about who they're allied with. Freedom of the seas, you can't just shoot down or sink passenger ships. Removing economic barriers, making it easier to trade, reduce armaments, dealing with that militarism aspect of mania, and the adjustment of colonial claims. So if Germany and France are fighting over territory, let's sit down and end that dispute so that territorial disputes don't spill over into these large-scale conflicts. 6 through 13 address self-determination, the right to create borders based on ethnicity and national identity. It also means that one nation could not take territory from another. But note here, as you're looking at which territory is being divided, these are European territories. We're not talking about, African colonies governing themselves, or in French Indochina, right? Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, they're not governing themselves. We're talking about European nations and self-governance. And then also, the 14th point is the most important for Wilson. It's his baby, if you will. It is the creation of a League of Nations, this association of countries that would meet to try to mediate disputes using diplomacy instead of war.
1919. World War I officially came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles on June 28, 1919. 32 countries had come together in Paris in January 1919 to hold a conference which would make peace after the First World War. It would be dominated by the Big Three: David Lloyd George, representing Britain, George Clemenceau, representing France, and Woodrow Wilson, representing the USA. Germany was not invited. The Big Three wanted different things for Germany and disagreed on how harshly they were to be punished, reflecting how their countries were treated in the war. They had to negotiate with each other until there was a compromise. This was difficult because Wilson was opposed to harsh punishment for Germany. The USA had not been involved in the war as long as Britain and France, and had not received as much damage. He wanted to prevent another world war by creating the League of Nations based on his 14 points, to ensure Germany would not be destroyed, and that Germany shouldn't be blamed for the war. Clemenceau's aims were the harshest of the three, representing the damage Germany had done to France's land and people, and its threatening proximity. He wanted revenge and to punish Germany, to return Alsace-Lorraine to France, and independent Rhineland. No League of Nations. Germany to pay huge reparations for the damage and losses caused. The disbandment of the German army so that Germany would never be strong enough to attack France again. Lloyd George was an in-between. This reflected Britain, which had little land damage but high war losses. He wanted a punishment that would be tough enough to please those who wanted to make Germany pay, but would leave Germany strong enough to still trade. Land for Britain's empire. To safeguard Britain's naval supremacy. When the Treaty of Versailles was ready, Germany was shown the document, but there was no negotiation. Their rebuttal ignored. On 28 June 1919, the delegates met at the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles near Paris and forced 2 German representatives to sign it. See Part 2.
We'll see part 2 in just a minute. Actually, we may not see part 2. The war guilt clause is Article 231. It forces Germany to accept full blame for World War I. And if you think about the causes of the war, you can sort of decide for yourself whether or not you think the harshness of the treaty, including Article 231, was justified, was warranted. Germany, with accepting the blame for the start of the war, would also have to pay all of the costs of the war incurred in allied countries. Essentially, it amounts to $33 billion that would be paid over 30 years. Germany will lose colonies. It will lose the Alsace-Lorraine territory. That will go to France. Schleswig territory will go to Denmark, and East Prussia will go to Poland. The German Army and Navy are going to be reduced to nothing more than a sort of a defensive force of less than 100,000 men total, and they're also prohibited from manufacturing war materials. Germany has really been devastated by the war. They are consistently being told, the soldiers are consistently being told that they're winning. And so they referred to the men who signed the treaty as November criminals. Remember, it's November 11th. And immediately in Weimar, Germany, this new government that is formed, there is a distrust, especially on the part of a lot of the soldiers who come home disillusioned, having given, so much to this cause that they believed in, and being told right up until the end that they could win, being brought home to a country that had been humiliated and economically devastated. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the run-up to World War II. A lot of soldiers were incredibly upset and disillusioned. And this picture right here shows you that little red circle. That's Hitler, who had served as a soldier in World War I and is one of the many soldiers who comes home angry. Of course, we know what Hitler does with his anger. I think I will play this short little video wrap-up.
The Treaty of Versailles, 1919. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles can be divided into 3 groups: territorial, military, and financial and economic. Here are some of the territorial terms. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. Germany was forbidden to unite with Austria. Lands in East Germany, including the farmlands of Posen and the Polish corridor between East Germany and East Prussia, were given to Poland. The Saar, which had rich coal fields, were given to France for 15 years. All Germany's colonies were taken and given to France and Britain as mandates. Here are some of the military terms. The German army was restricted to only 100,000 men. The Navy could now only have 6 battleships and no submarines, and there was to be no air force allowed. The Rhineland was demilitarized. This meant the German army could not go to this area between France and Germany. For the financial and economic terms, Germany would have to pay reparations, which would eventually be set at an enormous 132 billion gold marks. On top of this, Germany was not allowed to join the League of Nations, and it had to accept responsibility for causing all the damage and loss by the war. Overall, the Treaty of Versailles was unpopular with Germany and its creators. Its terms would go on to be reversed by Germany in both secret and in the open by Hitler, and help cause World War II.
Okay. In terms of Wilson, because we want to bring this back to U.S. history, right? Points 1 through 5 are largely ignored. He has limited success with some of those 6 through 13, those points that were related to self-determination. He does get point 15, which was his most important point, the League of Nations. But he has a problem. The irreconcilables and the reservationists, and we're going to do some folder work about this. Essentially, Wilson has a difficult time selling it to people back home. There were many people who are in this camp known as the irreconcilables, for whom they could not imagine any situation in which they would want to be part of an international organization designed to mediate disputes, because in their mind, being too interventionist is exactly, and too involved in world affairs is exactly what got them into a giant world war in the first place, and they want to be much more isolationists. Reservationists could see themselves accepting the treaty, but they had some concerns. They wanted a couple of tweaks. Wilson decides to take his case to the American people, as you can see in that political cartoon down there at the bottom left, when Congress is seeming to balk at the ratification of the treaty. He travels across the country, eventually sacrificing his health. He has a pretty massive stroke while trying to convince the American people that we wanted to be a part of the League of Nations. Ultimately, the Senate will fail to ratify the treaty and negotiates a separate treaty with the combatants after Wilson leaves office in 1921. After the war, the government, and we're moving into the economics and politics of the 20s, but just as a quick little overview. The government will remove wartime restrictions that had been previously placed on businesses. Prices will go up in response to growing demand, will lead to inflation. But jobs for returning soldiers are difficult to find. And although prices are increasing for things, workers are not being paid more. So they're failing to keep up with the cost of living. And remember all those strikes that had been downplayed and made illegal during the war, those are back now. Those are back in play. And you can see some strikes that are listed on the bottom left. Calvin Coolidge is mentioned there. He's going to be the governor of Massachusetts when the Boston police go on strike. And Calvin Coolidge famously says it's illegal for anyone in public safety to go on strike because, quote, there is no right to strike against public safety. And there are increasing fears because of this communist revolution in Russia in 1917 and the rhetoric that they wanted communism to spread. There are increasing fears that these unions are, bastions of communism and that these strikes are just ways to promote a communist agenda. There are also a lot of soldiers who return home and find that instead of being able to go back to their factory job, in fact, there are no jobs in these northern factories. And they are going to blame African Americans, many of whom had moved north during the Great Migration that we've talked about before, and taken factory jobs in the north, sort of moved where the jobs were. And so there's some racial strife that we're going to be discussing as well. Oh, that's what this is. So in the summer of 1919, there are 25 different race riots for various reasons. African American neighborhoods, in some cases, are entirely burned down. We're going to talk about the rise of the KKK. Not the rise for the first time, but I should say the resurgence of the KKK. Let's see. I think we've talked about most of this. This is Oscar DePriest down here in the bottom right. He's going to be the first African-American congressman from Chicago, just evidence of the fact that so many African-Americans had moved north. There will be some strides. I've already uploaded for you a short little review video about I.W. Wells, the NAACP working to promote lynching, due in large part to her drawing attention to the issue. And then a magazine called The Crisis is published by the NAACP. And this is a really famous line from The Crisis in 1919. And it's talking about African American soldiers having fought in World War I and returning home to continue discrimination and segregation. He says, we return from fighting. We return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States of America, or know the reason why. So many times you'll hear a reference to a double victory against, especially in World War II, but the same sort of rhetoric applies, fighting against the evils of illiberalism and fascism ultimately in Europe. but coming home and being greeted by continued discrimination at home. And then this is Marcus Garvey. We definitely need to mention Marcus Garvey. We've talked a lot about African American leaders like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, I showed you Oscar DePriest a second ago. But Marcus Garvey is going to start during this time period to promote something known as Negro nationalism. It's a movement based in Harlem where essentially he says that African Americans will never find freedom in a white society and instead should move to Africa. And sort of start over. He's ultimately going to be, it's obviously a controversial position, he's ultimately going to be convicted of mail fraud, and that will be the excuse the government used to deport him because he is not an American-born citizen. He's actually born in Jamaica, and so he is deported in 1927. I've got a short little biography clip on here that's pretty interesting. Oh, I thought it would enlarge it.
Marcus Garvey wanted to return African Americans to Africa, to create a vibrant black nation, empowered through economic independence. Although some of his goals were controversial, his crusade would inspire leaders from Malcolm X to Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela.
Garvey was certainly a controversial figure, but the concepts that we now think of as black nationalism and black pride started with Garvey's pronouncements.
Marcus Mosiah Garvey was born in St. Anne's Bay, Jamaica, on August 17, 1887. Beginning as a printer's apprentice at 14, Garvey became a union organizer and later worked various jobs across Central America.
Marcus Garvey found wherever he went, black people of the African heritage in particular were always on the lower stratification end of society. This had a profound impact on him. Particularly, his concern was for the uplift of African people globally.
In 1912, Garvey sailed to London, England, and took night courses at Birkbeck College. After working for a Pan-African newspaper, Garvey returned to Jamaica in 1914 and formed the United Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA.
The UNIA was about black self-determination. It was about galvanizing the ideas of black repatriation to the motherland, the continent of Africa. And it was extremely important in terms of getting black people to understand self-pride, pride in one's race.
Inspired by Booker T. Washington to raise funds and start his own school, Garvey came to the United States in 1916. And in 1918 began publishing the Negro World newspaper.
Garvey was extremely outspoken. He was, some people would say, almost bombastic. He wanted to take over Africa and had elected himself as president of Africa without consulting the Africans, unfortunately.
Determined to achieve economic independence for African Americans, Garvey launched the Negroes Factories Association in 1919. And a shipping company called the Black Star Line, which he planned to use to transport passengers back to Africa.
Garvey was a great organizer, but unfortunately not a great businessman. During the time that Garvey and the UNIA were trying to launch the Black Star Line, they solicited funds from investors for stock options through the mail. And this resulted later on in allegations of mail fraud, and Garvey was convicted and sent to prison.
After serving 5 years in prison, Garvey was deported. He eventually moved to London, and in 1938, he supported the Greater Liberia Act, created by known white supremacist Senator Theodore Bilbo from Mississippi.
Marcus Garvey's association with Senator Bilbo is related more on a practical level rather than an intellectual like for each other. Marcus Garvey's attempt to help Africans in America leave and go to Africa fell in line with some aspects of KKK philosophy.
Garvey died in London on June 10, 1940. He was reinterred in Jamaica in 1964 and is hailed as Jamaica's first national hero and the prophet of the Rastafarian religion.
Although Garvey was a flawed leader, He's someone who is really important to the history of the Black radical tradition. He was probably one of the strongest voices of Black nationalism in history.
A fascinating character for sure. I also mentioned the fears over the rise of communism in Russia, this rhetoric that many communists in Russia were using about a worldwide movement, creates a lot of fear of Eastern European immigrants in particular. Who had come to the United States. Were they going to be bringing communism here? Are they infiltrating our government? There were also a series of bombs that were mailed to some fairly prominent figures in law enforcement, and one of them being Mitchell Palmer, who's the Attorney General. He's going to start to hunt down people responsible for these bombs in a series of events known as the Palmer Raids. He will target people primarily who are foreign-born, but there's no evidence of like a larger conspiracy that's ever found. This is also the time of Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian anarchist immigrants who had been arrested and convicted of robbery and murder. The evidence is extremely questionable, but they will ultimately be executed. And there's this really wonderful cartoon that sort of sums up how people start to think of unions. So there's the labor movement. The first step in this descent towards Bolshevism and chaos is strikes, disorder, Bolshevism, chaos, step by step, so it says, into waters unknown. The election of 1920 sees Warren Harding emerge victorious. We'll be talking more about him. He is a Republican who campaigns on the slogan, "A return to normalcy." Doesn't that just sound like a beautiful thing, right? A return to normalcy. He has a lot of success with that slogan, as you can see. His vice president will be Calvin Coolidge, and as we will learn shortly, Warren G. Harding will die while in office. He will have a stroke in office and die, a heart attack, I should say, and Calvin Coolidge will become president at that point. So we will continue all of this soon.